The apartment was too quiet. Margaret Henley stood in the doorway of what had been their bedroom for 43 years, her hand still resting on the doorframe as if the wood itself might offer some anchor to reality. The morning light came through the Venetian blinds in strips, gold and shadow, falling across the empty bed she'd finally made after 3 weeks of leaving it untouched. She could still smell his aftershave. Old Spice. The bottle sat on the dresser where he'd left it, next to his reading glasses and the Tom Clancy novel he'd never finished. The red bookmark was still there, inserted at page 247, as though he might walk back through that door and pick up where he'd left off. But he wouldn't. The funeral had been 12 days ago, 11 days since the casseroles stopped arriving, 10 days since her daughter flew back to Seattle with promises to call every Sunday, 9 days since the silence became so loud she could hear it ringing in her ears at 3 a.m. Margaret was 67 years old. She had been a wife since she was 24, a mother since she was 26, a grandmother since she was 49. But now, standing in this too-quiet apartment on Mockingbird Lane in Dallas, Texas, she wasn't sure what she was anymore. The telephone rang. She didn't move to answer it. It would be Patricia from church, or maybe Linda from the book club she hadn't attended in a month. Kind voices asking how she was holding up, if she needed anything, reminding her that grief takes time. But they didn't understand. It wasn't just grief. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that she had no idea who Margaret Henley was when she wasn't standing next to Robert Henley. The ringing stopped. The silence rushed back in like water filling a hull. And in that silence, something shifted. Not in the room. In her. She had lost her husband, but perhaps, in the wreckage of that loss, she might find something else entirely. This is the story of Margaret Henley, a woman who spent most of her life being exactly who she was supposed to be. A devoted wife, a loving mother, a woman who kept a clean house, attended church on Sundays, and never forgot a birthday. She lived in Dallas, Texas, in a modest 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like lemon pledge and fresh coffee. She had gray hair she wore in a practical bob, sensible shoes, and a closet full of pastel cardigans. By all accounts, Margaret had lived a good life. Not a remarkable one, perhaps, but a good one. Steady, safe, predictable. But when her husband Robert died suddenly of a heart attack in February 1991, Margaret found herself facing something she'd never truly confronted before. Herself. Not as someone's wife, not as someone's mother, just herself. What happened next surprised everyone, including Margaret. Before we continue with this story, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Never Too Late. Every week we share real stories that remind you age is just a number. Because what Margaret discovered in the months following Robert's death would challenge everything she thought she knew about age, identity, and the possibility of beginning again. Margaret Ruth Patterson met Robert James Henley at a church social in the summer of 1947. She was 23, fresh out of secretarial school, wearing a yellow dress her mother had made and white gloves she'd borrowed from her sister. He was 26, just back from the Pacific, still getting used to sleeping through the night without jolting awake at every sound. They married 9 months later in a small ceremony at First Baptist Church. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. Robert wore his father's suit. They honeymooned for 3 days in Galveston, staying in a boarding house that smelled like salt and old wood, and came home to a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of Dallas with exactly $217 in savings. It was enough. For 43 years, it had been enough. Margaret learned to cook from Robert's mother. Pot roast and cornbread, chicken and dumplings, peach cobbler that Robert said was better than his mama's, though Margaret knew he was lying and loved him for it. She learned to stretch $1, to darn socks, to make curtains from old bed sheets. She learned the particular rhythm of Robert's moods, when to speak and when to stay quiet, when he needed space and when he needed her close. She bore 2 children, Daniel in 1950, Catherine in 1953. She nursed them, raised them, sent them off to school with lunches packed in brown paper bags and notes tucked inside that said, "Mommy loves you," until they were old enough to tell her it was embarrassing. She drove them to Little League and ballet lessons. She helped with homework at the kitchen table, the overhead light making a warm circle in the evening dark. She watched them grow up and away, the way children do. Daniel became an engineer, moved to Houston, visited twice a year. Catherine became a teacher, moved to Seattle, called every Tuesday, and Margaret remained Margaret, Robert's wife, Daniel and Catherine's mother. The woman at church who always brought the best deviled eggs to potluck dinners. Her days had a rhythm as familiar as breathing. She woke at 6:30, even on weekends. Made coffee in the percolator Robert had bought her for their 20th anniversary. Fixed breakfast, scrambled eggs for Robert, toast with strawberry jam for herself. They ate together at the small kitchen table, Robert reading the Dallas Morning News, Margaret reading the comics and Dear Abby. She did laundry on Mondays, grocery shopping on Wednesdays at the Piggly Wiggly on Henderson Avenue. Cleaned the apartment on Fridays, even though it was never really dirty. Bridge club on Thursday afternoons, church on Sundays. Robert worked at an insurance company downtown for 38 years, the same gray suit and blue tie combination every day, coming home at 5:45 with the evening paper tucked under his arm. They ate dinner at 6, watched the news at 6:30, Wheel of Fortune at 7, Jeopardy at 7:30, in bed by 10. It was a life built on routine, on small comforts, on the accumulated weight of shared years. Margaret never thought to question it. She had friends, of course. Patricia from church, who talked too much about her grandchildren. Linda from Bridge Club, who always wore too much perfume. Barbara from the apartment next door, who'd been widowed young and never remarried. They had coffee together sometimes, talked about their children, their health problems, the rising cost of groceries, safe topics, surface topics. But Margaret never told them about the dreams she'd had as a girl, about how she'd wanted to be a teacher before she met Robert, about the journal she'd kept in high school, filled with poems she'd never shown anyone, about how sometimes, ironing Robert's shirts on a Tuesday afternoon, she'd catch herself staring out the window at the live oak tree in the courtyard and wonder what her life would have looked like if she'd made different choices. She never told them because she'd never told herself. There was a contentment in not asking too many questions, a safety in staying within the lines. Margaret knew women who'd gotten divorced, who'd gone back to work, who'd cut their hair short and started wearing pants to church. She'd watched them with a mixture of fascination and something else she couldn't quite name. Not judgment, exactly. More like fear. Fear of what it might mean to step outside the boundaries of who you'd always been. Robert was a good man. Not passionate, perhaps, not demonstrative, but steady, reliable. He never raised his voice, never drank too much, never gave her reason to doubt him. He provided, he protected, he was there until he wasn't. It happened on a Tuesday morning, February 12th, 1991. Margaret was making coffee in the kitchen, still in her bathrobe, when she heard a sound from the bedroom. Not quite a shout, not quite a gasp. Something in between. She found him sitting on the edge of the bed, one sock on, one sock off, his face pale and his left hand clutching his chest. Robert. He looked at her with eyes that seemed confused, almost apologetic. "I don't feel right," he said. Those were the last words he ever spoke to her. The paramedics were there in 9 minutes. They worked on him in the bedroom, then in the ambulance, then in the emergency room at Baylor Hospital. Margaret sat in the waiting room with its beige walls and fluorescent lights and magazines from 6 months ago, her hands folded in her lap, still wearing her bathrobe under her winter coat because she hadn't thought to change. A doctor came out at 11:17. She would remember the exact time for the rest of her life because she was staring at the wall clock when he walked through the double doors. And something about his face made her look away from the clock and meet his eyes. And in that moment, before he spoke, she already knew. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Henley. Massive coronary. There was nothing they could do. It was quick. He didn't suffer. These were the things people said when someone died. The scripted lines meant to provide comfort. Margaret nodded, thanked him, asked if she could see her husband. They led her to a curtained area where Robert lay on a gurney, a white sheet pulled up to his chest. He looked smaller than she remembered, older. His face had a waxy quality in the harsh hospital light. She touched his hand. It was already cool. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Phone calls, arrangements, the funeral. Daniel flew in from Houston, Catherine from Seattle. They took over, handling details Margaret couldn't seem to focus on. Black dress, closed casket. Hymns. Robert had never particularly cared about. A reception at the church with sandwiches cut into triangles and punch in paper cups. People said things, offered condolences, told her Robert was in a better place, told her it would get easier with time, told her she was so strong. She wasn't strong, she was numb. Catherine stayed for 5 days, Daniel for 4. They cleaned out Robert's closet, sorted through his papers, helped her figure out the bills and the insurance and all the practical matters that Margaret had never had to handle before. They were kind. They were helpful. They treated her like she might break. And then they left, and Margaret was alone. The apartment felt too big and too small at the same time. Too big because it echoed with emptiness. Too small because everywhere she looked, she saw Robert, his coffee cup in the dish drainer, his crossword puzzle book on the end table, the indent in his side of the couch from 40 years of sitting in the same spot. She tried to maintain the routines, woke at 6:30, made coffee, but she couldn't eat breakfast, couldn't read the newspaper, just sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug that grew cold while she stared at nothing. The women from church checked on her, brought casseroles, invited her to Bible study. Margaret thanked them, told them she was fine, didn't mention that she lay awake until 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, wondering how it was possible to feel so utterly alone in a life that had been so full. 3 weeks after the funeral, Margaret stood in the doorway of their bedroom and made the bed, smoothed the comforter, fluffed the pillows, opened the Venetian blinds, and let the light in. She told herself it was progress. But standing there, looking at that perfectly made bed in that too quiet room, Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest. Not her heart breaking. That had already happened. This was different. This was the sound of something old and calcified finally splitting apart. She had been Robert's wife for 43 years. But who was Margaret? The question came to her at odd moments, washing dishes, folding laundry, standing in line at the grocery store. Who was Margaret? Not Margaret Henley, wife of Robert. Not Margaret Henley, mother of Daniel and Catherine. Just Margaret. The woman underneath all those roles and titles and expectations. She didn't know. It terrified her. The woman from apartment 3B found her one afternoon in early March, sitting on the bench in the courtyard, staring at the live oak tree, Barbara, the young widow who'd never remarried. She was only 53, though her eyes looked older. "Mind if I sit?" Margaret gestured to the empty space beside her. They sat in silence for a while, a pleasant silence, the kind that didn't demand filling. "How long?" Barbara finally asked. "How long what?" "How long before you stopped feeling like a ghost?" Margaret turned to look at her. Barbara was staring straight ahead, her profile sharp against the afternoon light. "I'm not sure I understand." "After Frank died," Barbara said quietly, "I spent 2 years moving through the world like I wasn't really there, like I was watching my own life from somewhere outside my body. I went to work, came home, ate dinner, went to bed. But I wasn't really living. I was just existing, haunting my own life." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. "How did you stop?" Barbara smiled, but it was a sad smile. "One day I realized that Frank was gone, but I wasn't. And I could spend the rest of my life being the woman Frank left behind, or I could figure out who I was without him. She paused. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than losing him. Different. Losing him happened to me. Finding myself. That was a choice I had to make. After Barbara left, Margaret sat on that bench until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She thought about choices, about the life she'd lived and the life she might still live, about the difference between existing and living. That night, she couldn't sleep. She got up at 2 a.m, put on her bathrobe, and stood in the middle of the living room. The apartment was dark except for the streetlight bleeding through the curtains. She could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing on Mockingbird Lane. And in that darkness, Margaret made a decision. She was going to find out who she was. She started small, almost absurdly small. The next morning, she made herself a different breakfast. Not toast with strawberry jam, a boiled egg and sliced tomatoes. It was ridiculous how significant it felt, choosing something different, breaking a pattern that had been carved into her life for decades. She ate slowly, tasting the food instead of just consuming it. The next day, she didn't make the bed right away, left it rumpled and unmade until after lunch. It made her uncomfortable, seeing it like that. But there was also something liberating about it, a small rebellion against the rigid structure of her old life. She stopped going to bridge club on Thursdays. Patricia called, concerned. Margaret told her she needed some time. Patricia said she understood, though her voice suggested otherwise. She started taking walks. Long walks with no particular destination. Through the neighborhood, past the elementary school, along the streets she'd driven 1,000 times but never really looked at. She noticed things. The way the light fell through the branches of the pecan trees, the sound of wind chimes on someone's porch, the smell of honeysuckle beginning to bloom. She felt like a stranger in her own life. It was disorienting, but it was also, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, thrilling. One afternoon in late March, Margaret found herself standing in front of the Dallas Public Library on Young Street. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been inside a library. 20 years, 30. She climbed the steps and pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The smell hit her immediately, books and old paper and possibility. She stood in the entrance, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of choices. Where did she even start? She wandered through the aisles, running her fingers along the spines. Fiction, biography, history, poetry. She pulled books at random, read the first few pages, put them back, and then, in the art section, she found it. A book about Georgia O'Keeffe. The cover showed one of O'Keeffe's flower paintings, vibrant and alive. Margaret opened it and began to read. She learned that O'Keeffe had been in her 40s when she truly found her voice as an artist, that she'd spent years painting in obscurity before anyone recognized her genius, that she'd moved to New Mexico alone, against everyone's advice, and created some of her most powerful work in solitude. Margaret checked out the book, and 3 others. She carried them home like treasures. That night, instead of watching television, she read. She read about O'Keeffe's life, her struggles, her fierce independence. She read about a woman who had refused to be defined by others' expectations, who had found herself not by looking back, but by looking inward. Something began to shift inside Margaret. A small spark, a possibility. The next day, she did something she hadn't done in 50 years. She went to an art supply store. The teenager behind the counter looked at her with barely concealed boredom. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to buy some paints," Margaret said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, uncertain but determined. "What kind? Acrylic, oil, watercolor?" "I don't know." Margaret felt her face flush. "I've never painted before." The teenager's expression shifted. Not quite interest, but at least attention. "Never. Not since elementary school." "How old are you?" The question was rude but honest. 67. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then the teenager smiled, a real smile. "That's cool. Let me show you some beginner sets." Margaret walked out with a bag full of supplies, watercolors, brushes, paper, a how-to book for beginners. It had cost more than she'd spent on herself in years. She felt guilty and exhilarated in equal measure. At home, she spread everything out on the kitchen table. The paints in their little tubes, the brushes with their soft bristles, the blank white paper that seemed to hold infinite possibility. She had no idea what she was doing. She opened the how-to book, read about color mixing, brush techniques, basic composition. The language was foreign to her, but she studied it like she was learning a new tongue. And then, with hands that shook slightly, she began to paint. The first attempt was terrible, a muddy brown mess that looked nothing like the flower she'd been trying to capture. She almost threw it away, almost packed up the supplies and returned them the next day, told herself she was being ridiculous, a 67-year-old woman trying to become an artist. But she didn't. She tried again, and again, and again. The paintings were bad, objectively bad. Colors that clashed, proportions that were off, brush strokes that looked childish and clumsy. But something about the act of painting, of creating something from nothing, of making choices about color and composition and what mattered enough to put on paper, made Margaret feel more alive than she had in years. She painted every day, in the morning with her coffee, in the afternoon when the light was good, late into the evening when she couldn't sleep. She painted flowers and trees and the view from her window. She painted her coffee cup and Robert's reading glasses and the shadows on the wall. She didn't show anyone, didn't tell Patricia or Linda or Barbara. This was hers, private, sacred. The paintings improved, slowly. She learned to mix colors, to control the water-to-paint ratio, to see the relationship between light and shadow. She watched YouTube videos at the library, studied paintings at the Dallas Museum of Art, began to develop something that might, generously, be called a style. But more than the technical skill, something else was developing, a sense of self, a voice. The woman who had been buried under decades of wifehood and motherhood was beginning to emerge. Margaret Henley, artist. It sounded ridiculous, presumptuous. She wasn't an artist. She was a 67-year-old widow with no training and no talent and no business calling herself anything of the sort. But when she held a brush, when she mixed colors on her palette, when she stood back and looked at what she'd created, however imperfect, however amateur, she felt something she hadn't felt in 43 years of marriage. She felt like herself. One evening in May, Catherine called for their weekly Tuesday conversation. They talked about Catherine's teaching, her husband's new job, the weather in Seattle, the safe topics, the surface topics. And then Catherine said, "Mom, Daniel and I have been talking. We're worried about you." "Worried? Why?" "You sound different, distant. You haven't been going to church. Patricia called and said you quit bridge club. Are you okay? Is this about Dad?" Margaret looked at the painting she'd been working on when the phone rang. A sunset over the courtyard, orange and pink and purple bleeding together. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. "I'm fine, sweetheart." "You don't sound fine. You sound, I don't know, changed. Yes, that was exactly the word. "I'm painting," Margaret said. The words came out before she could stop them. Silence on the other end. Then, painting. With watercolors. "I take walks. I read books about art. I've been going to the museum. I'm finding out who I am." "Mom?" Catherine's voice was gentle, careful. The voice you'd use with someone who might be losing touch with reality. "I know losing Dad was hard, but maybe you're doing too much too fast. Have you thought about talking to someone? A therapist? Or maybe a grief counselor?" "I don't need a therapist. I need to paint." "Mom." "Catherine." Margaret's voice was firm, surprising herself. "I love you, but I'm 67 years old. I've spent my entire adult life being who I was supposed to be. I was a good wife. I was a good mother, but I don't know if I was ever really me, and I'd like to find out before I die." Another long silence. Then Catherine said, quietly, Okay, Mom. Okay. After they hung up, Margaret stood in her kitchen and cried. Not from sadness, from something else, relief, maybe, or freedom, or fear, or all of it at once. She was finding herself, and it was terrifying and exhilarating and entirely her own. The painting changed everything, not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly, steadily, the way water reshapes stone. Margaret's days acquired a new rhythm. She woke earlier now, eager to catch the morning light. She painted for 2 hours before breakfast, lost in the flow of water and pigment. She walked to the library, checked out books about artists she'd never heard of, Cassatt, Klee, Rothko, Frankenthaler. She studied their techniques, their philosophies, their lives. She learned that Grandma Moses didn't start painting until she was 78, that Louise Bourgeois created some of her most celebrated work in her 80s, that Hokusai, the Japanese master, said everything he created before 70 was worthless, and that his real work began at 73. These stories sustained her. By June, her apartment had transformed. Paintings covered every wall, taped up, thumbtacked, propped on shelves. A visual diary of her evolution. The early attempts, muddy and uncertain. The gradual improvement. The emergence of something that was uniquely hers, loose, flowing watercolors in unexpected color combinations. Flowers that weren't quite realistic, but captured something essential. Landscapes that felt more like emotions than places. Barbara from 3B was the first person to see them. She'd stopped by one Saturday morning, ostensibly to borrow sugar. But when she stepped inside, she froze. Margaret, she turned slowly, taking in the walls. Did you do all of these? Margaret felt her face flush. They're not very good. I'm just learning. They're beautiful. They're amateur. They're honest. Barbara walked closer to one painting, a loose interpretation of the courtyard oak tree. This is how you see the world, isn't it? Not as it is, but as it feels. Margaret hadn't thought of it that way. But yes, that was exactly it. How long have you been painting? 3 months. Barbara looked at her with something like wonder. You found it. Found what? Yourself. Word spread. Patricia from church came by, drawn by Barbara's descriptions. She looked at the paintings with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been envy. I didn't know you were artistic, she said. Neither did I. Linda from Bridge Club came next. She studied the paintings with a critical eye. You should show these, she said. Enter them in a competition or something. Don't be ridiculous. I'm 67 years old. I've been painting for 3 months. So? It was such a simple question. So? But Margaret couldn't answer it. All her life, she'd been bound by invisible rules about what was appropriate, what was possible, what people like her, women her age, from her background, with her experience, were allowed to do or want or become. Linda was asking why those rules mattered. Margaret didn't know. In July, Daniel came to visit. He'd told Catherine he was worried, that maybe their mother was having some kind of breakdown. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, carrying a bouquet of grocery store flowers and wearing the expression of someone preparing for difficult news. Margaret met him at the door with paint under her fingernails and joy in her eyes. Mom. He hugged her, held on a little too long. You look different. Do I? Younger somehow. She led him inside. Watched his face as he took in the paintings. Jesus, Mom. Did you do all these? Language, Daniel? He laughed. The tension in his shoulders eased. He walked from painting to painting, studying each one. Margaret waited, nervous, for his verdict. Finally, he turned to her. Mom, these are good, really good. You don't have to say that. I'm not just saying it. I mean it. He gestured at a painting of her coffee cup on the kitchen table. Morning light streaming through the window. This one. It makes me feel something. Like I'm there. Like I can smell the coffee. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Catherine thinks I'm losing my mind. Catherine thinks everyone should follow the rules. But Mom? He sat down on the couch, looked at her with adult eyes that still somehow held the little boy she'd raised. Are you happy? It was such a simple question. Yes, Margaret said, and realized it was true. I'm happy. Then that's all that matters. After Daniel left, Margaret stood in her paint-covered apartment and felt something settle inside her. A rightness, a peace. She was happy. Not because her life was perfect, not because she didn't still miss Robert, didn't still wake up sometimes reaching for him in the dark, but because she was living, really living, making choices, creating beauty, becoming someone she'd never known she could be. In August, Linda convinced her to enter a piece in a community art show at the Fair Park Creative Arts Center. It's nothing fancy, Linda said, just local artists, but you should do it. Margaret selected a painting of the courtyard in evening light, gold and purple and shadow. She matted it herself, mounted it on foam board, filled out the entry form with hands that shook slightly. The opening was on a Friday night. Margaret almost didn't go. Stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to wear, wondering what she'd been thinking, entering a competition at 67 with only 5 months of experience. But she went. The community center was packed. Paintings lined every wall, sculptures occupied pedestals, photographs hung in careful rows. Margaret found her painting in the back corner of the second room. It looked small and insignificant next to the others. She was about to leave when she heard someone say, "I love this one." A woman was standing in front of Margaret's painting. She was maybe 40, wearing black and silver jewelry that jangled when she moved. She leaned closer to read the title card. Evening Light, Margaret Henley. The woman turned. Are you Margaret Henley? I am. This is beautiful, really beautiful. The way you've captured the quality of light. It's not realistic, but it's true. Does that make sense? I think so. How long have you been painting? Margaret almost lied, almost added years to make herself seem more legitimate, but she didn't. 5 months. The woman's eyes widened. 5 months? I started in March. That's incredible. Do you have more work? My apartment is full of it. The woman handed her a card. I run a small gallery in Oak Lawn. We focus on emerging artists. I'd love to see more of your work. Would you be willing to show me? Margaret took the card, stared at it, read the name 3 times to make sure she wasn't imagining it. I'm 67 years old, she heard herself say. I'm not emerging. I don't know what I am. The woman smiled. You're an artist. That's what you are. 2 weeks later, Margaret met Rebecca Santos, the woman from the art show, at a coffee shop in Oak Lawn. She brought 20 paintings, her hands trembling as she laid them out on the table between them. Rebecca studied each one carefully. Didn't speak for a long time. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Finally, these are extraordinary. You don't have to be kind. I'm not being kind. I'm being honest. There's a rawness to these, an emotional immediacy that you don't find in a lot of work. You're not trying to prove anything. You're just seeing and showing us what you see. She looked up at Margaret. I'd like to give you a show, a solo exhibition, 3 months from now, November. Is that enough time to produce 10 to 15 more pieces? Margaret couldn't breathe. You're serious. Completely. But I'm not. I don't have training. I don't have a degree. I'm just a widow from Dallas who started painting because she didn't know what else to do with her grief. Rebecca reached across the table and touched her hand. Margaret, that's exactly why your work matters. Because it's true. Because you're not trying to be anyone but yourself. The exhibition opened on November 15th, 1991. Margaret Henley, late bloomer, read the announcement. Margaret had protested the title. Rebecca had insisted. You're proving something important, Rebecca said. That it's never too late. That age is just a number. That you can discover who you are at 67 just as easily as at 27. The opening was small, maybe 30 people, friends from the neighborhood, Barbara from 3B, Linda from the old bridge club, Patricia from church, looking uncomfortable in the modern gallery space. Daniel flew in from Houston. Catherine came from Seattle, her face a mixture of pride and confusion. And strangers, people Margaret had never met, wandering through the gallery, looking at her paintings, reading her artist statement with its honest admission. I started painting 5 months after my husband died because I realized I didn't know who I was without him. These paintings are my attempt to find out. Rebecca sold 3 pieces that night. 3. Strangers paid money for Margaret's paintings, hung them in their homes, looked at them every day. Margaret stood in the gallery, surrounded by her work, and felt something she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing it. She felt seen, not as Robert's wife, not as Daniel and Catherine's mother, but as Margaret, artist, creator, woman who had lost everything and found herself in the wreckage. Later that night, after the gallery had emptied, after Daniel and Catherine had returned to their hotel, Margaret stood alone among her paintings. The space was quiet, except for the hum of the track lighting. She thought about Robert, about the life they'd built together, about the routines and rhythms that had felt like home. She didn't regret those years, couldn't regret them. They'd given her children she loved, memories she treasured, a foundation she'd stood on. But she also didn't regret this discovery, this emergence, this late blooming. She pulled out her phone and called Catherine. "Mom, is everything okay? I just wanted to thank you." "Thank me? For what?" "For worrying about me, for caring, for flying all the way out here even though you thought I was losing my mind." Catherine's laugh was soft. "I don't think you're losing your mind anymore. What do you think?" "I think you're finding yourself, and I think Dad would be proud of you." After they hung up, Margaret walked one more time through the gallery, studied each painting as if seeing it for the first time. The flowers and landscapes and ordinary objects transformed by her vision, her voice, her truth. She was 67 years old. She'd been painting for 8 months. She'd had her first solo exhibition. She'd sold 3 paintings, and she was just beginning. Over the following months, Margaret's life continued to unfold in ways she never could have imagined. Rebecca invited her to participate in a group show with other local artists. A small article appeared in the Dallas Observer. "Local Widow Finds New Life Through Art." The headline made her wince, but the article was kind, thoughtful, honest about both her age and her inexperience. More people came to see her work. Not crowds, not fame, but a steady trickle of individuals who connected with what she was creating. A retired teacher who bought a painting of morning light through kitchen windows because it reminded her of her grandmother's house. A young woman who chose a piece because it captured how she felt about her own life transitions. A man in his 70s who stood in front of one painting for 15 minutes, then bought it without asking the price. Each sale felt like validation, not of her skill. She was still learning, still struggling, still producing work that was imperfect and uncertain, but validation of her right to try, her right to begin again, her right to discover who she was at an age when most people assumed such discoveries were long past. But perhaps more important than the sales or the small recognitions were the quieter transformations. The way Margaret began to move through the world with more confidence. The way she spoke with more authority about her own choices and desires. The way she stopped apologizing for taking up space. She joined an art collective for older adults. Met other people who'd discovered creativity late in life. A 72-year-old former accountant who'd taken up sculpture. A 68-year-old retired nurse who photographed abandoned buildings. A 75-year-old widower who wrote poetry about loss and hope. They understood. They didn't question why she'd started so late, didn't treat her passion as a hobby or a phase or a way to fill empty time. They recognized it for what it was, a lifeline, a rebirth, a claiming of self. Margaret painted through the winter and into the spring. Her work evolved, became bolder, more confident. She experimented with larger formats, with mixed media, with subjects beyond her immediate surroundings. She painted her memories, her mother's garden, the beach in Galveston where she'd honeymooned, Robert's hands holding the newspaper at breakfast. She painted her emotions, grief rendered in deep blues and purples, joy in brilliant yellows and oranges, confusion in swirls of gray and green. She also began teaching. Rebecca connected her with a community center that offered art classes for seniors. Margaret taught basic watercolor every Wednesday afternoon to a group of 6 women and 2 men, all over 60, all hesitant and uncertain and secretly hopeful. "I'm not a real teacher," Margaret told Rebecca when she first suggested it. "I barely know what I'm doing myself." "That's exactly why you should teach," Rebecca replied. "You remember what it feels like to be a beginner. You won't intimidate them." So Margaret taught, and discovered that teaching deepened her own understanding, that explaining color theory forced her to articulate what she'd been learning intuitively, that watching her students struggle with the same challenges she'd faced reminded her how far she'd come. One of her students was a woman named Dorothy, 71 Darn, whose husband had recently moved into a memory care facility. Dorothy came to class with shaking hands and eyes that held decades of exhaustion. "I don't know why I'm here," Dorothy said on the first day. "I've never been artistic." "Neither was I," Margaret said, "until I was." By the end of the 8-week session, Dorothy had produced a series of paintings, clumsy but heartfelt, depicting memories of her husband before the disease took him. She cried when she finished the last one. So did Margaret. "Thank you," Dorothy whispered. "For what?" "For showing me it's possible. To start something new. To find joy even when everything feels broken." Margaret thought about that conversation for days afterward. About how her own journey had rippled outward, touching other lives. About how the simple act of choosing herself, of picking up a paintbrush and declaring that her life still had meaning and possibility, had given permission to others to do the same. This, she realized, was the real consequence of her transformation. Not the paintings or the sales or the small recognitions, but the example, the proof that it was never too late. That age didn't disqualify you from growth or discovery or reinvention, that you could lose everything and still find yourself. In May of 1992, 14 months after Robert's death, 13 months after her first painting, Margaret stood in her apartment preparing for a second solo exhibition. This one was larger, more ambitious. 23 new works. A catalog with an essay about late-life creativity. An opening that Rebecca predicted would draw twice the crowd of the first. Catherine called the night before the opening. "I'm proud of you, Mom." "Thank you, sweetheart. I'm also sorry." "Sorry. For what?" "For not understanding at first. For thinking you were just having a hard time adjusting. For not seeing that you weren't falling apart. You were coming together." Margaret felt tears blur her vision. "You were worried about me. That's what good daughters do. Still, I should have trusted you. Trusted that you knew what you needed." After they hung up, Margaret walked through her apartment, looked at all the paintings waiting to be transported to the gallery, each one a piece of her story, her grief, her hope, her becoming. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, standing in that too-quiet bedroom, not knowing who she was without Robert beside her, terrified and lost and hollow. She thought about the woman she was now, still grieving, still learning, still uncertain about so many things, but alive, fully, completely alive. Not just existing, but living, creating, growing, becoming. The opening was everything Rebecca had promised and more. The gallery was packed. Margaret's children were there, Daniel with his wife, Catherine with her husband and teenage daughter who looked at her grandmother with new eyes, as if seeing her for the first time as a person rather than just a role. Friends from the art collective, students from her class, strangers who'd read about her story, a reporter from the Dallas Morning News who interviewed her about creativity and aging and what it meant to begin again. "Do you ever regret not starting sooner?" the reporter asked. Margaret thought about the question, about all those years of routine and responsibility, about raising children and keeping house and being the person everyone needed her to be. "No," she said finally. "I couldn't have done this sooner. I wasn't ready. I hadn't lived enough, hadn't lost enough, hadn't learned enough about who I wasn't to discover who I was." She paused. "Maybe this was always meant to be a late blooming. Maybe I needed all those years to build up enough pressure that when I finally cracked open, something beautiful could grow." The reporter scribbled notes, then looked up with eyes that suggested she was older than her smooth face implied. "That's a lovely way to think about it." "It's the truth," Margaret said. "Or at least, it's my truth." 3 more paintings sold that night. A local collector expressed interest in commissioning a piece. Rebecca mentioned the possibility of a show in Houston, maybe even Austin. But what Margaret remembered most from that evening was a moment near the end, when the crowd had thinned and she was standing alone in front of her largest painting, a 5-foot canvas depicting the courtyard oak tree through all 4 seasons. Branches reaching upward in perpetual growth. An elderly man approached. He must have been in his 80s, bent with age but still moving with purpose. He studied the painting for a long time without speaking. Finally, he turned to her. "You're the artist?" "I am." "How old are you, if you don't mind my asking?" 68. He smiled, a beautiful smile that transformed his weathered face. "I'm 83. My wife died 6 years ago. I've been drifting, I suppose, going through the motions. But seeing your work, reading your story," he gestured at the painting, "it made me think maybe it's not too late for me either, to try something new, to find out who I am when I'm not half of a pear." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "It's never too late. Do you really believe that?" "I didn't a year ago, but I do now." He bought the painting, told her he was going to hang it in his living room as a reminder that growth doesn't have an expiration date, that becoming is a lifelong process, that you can plant seeds at 83 just as easily as at 18, and with enough care and courage, watch them bloom. After he left, Margaret stood in the gallery surrounded by her work and felt the full weight of what she'd done. Not just for herself, but for others. She'd become living proof that transformation was possible, that loss didn't have to be the end of the story, that you could honor what you'd been while still reaching toward what you might become. She'd lost her husband. That truth would always be with her, a scar on her heart that would never fully heal. But she'd found herself, and that discovery had given her something she'd been missing her entire life without knowing it. Freedom, purpose, voice, the courage to be authentically, unapologetically herself. Margaret Henley, artist. Margaret Henley, teacher. Margaret Henley, woman who bloomed late but bloomed brilliantly. Margaret Henley, finally and completely, herself. 3 years after Robert's death, Margaret Henley stood in her studio, no longer just an apartment, but a true working space, and contemplated the painting before her. She was 70 now. Her hands were steadier than they'd been at 67, her vision clearer, her understanding of who she was and what she wanted to say deeper and more nuanced. The studio walls were covered with work from different periods of her evolution, the early, tentative watercolors, the bolder experimentations, the recent pieces that critics were beginning to call mature and assured, a visual timeline of becoming. She thought about time often now, how strange it was, how we spent so much of it looking backward or forward, rarely residing fully in the present, how we treated age as an ending rather than simply another beginning. Robert would have been 73. Sometimes she talked to him while she painted. Not prayers, exactly. More like conversations with the memory of him, with the love that hadn't died even though he had. "I think you'd like who I've become," she said to the empty studio. "Or maybe you always knew this person was here, just waiting." Through the window, she could see the courtyard oak tree, bare branches reaching toward a winter sky. In a few months it would bloom again. The same tree, year after year, cycling through death and rebirth, never too old to grow new leaves, Never too late to reach toward the light. Margaret picked up her brush. There was still so much she wanted to paint, so much she wanted to say, so much life left to live. She was 70 years old, and she was just beginning. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. What would you change if you had a second chance? What dream have you put aside that might still be waiting for you? What version of yourself have you been too afraid to become? Margaret's story reminds us that transformation doesn't respect timelines, that the person you're meant to be might not emerge until you've lived enough to understand what that means. That loss and grief, as devastating as they are, can crack us open in ways that allow something new to grow. You don't need permission to begin again. You don't need to apologize for blooming late. You don't need to justify your desire to discover who you are beneath all the roles you've played. You just need to begin. Don't forget to subscribe to Never Too Late for more stories that remind us the next chapter of your life can be the most powerful one yet, because it's never too late to find yourself, to create beauty, to live authentically, to bloom. Age is just a number, but becoming, that's eternal.